I'm really excited to be here. This is actually my first time in Bend, and I am loving it so far. It's such a fun place to visit. So Elsa did a pretty good job introducing me. I'll just share a little bit about my books. I have 4 novels out currently with HarperCollins that are all for a middle grade audience. They're called Where the Watermelons Grow, Beginner's Welcome, The Stars of Whistling Ridge, and No Matter the Distance, which is what I'll be talking about today. I also have my first illustrated chapter book for younger readers coming out in November, which is about a girl who discovers a dragon living in the sewer in her city and has to keep it hidden from her parents because it keeps lighting things in their garden on fire. So I'm excited about that one. That was a really different kind of writing process for me. I want to start off by reading a little bit from the beginning of No Matter the Distance, and then I'm going to talk about the inspiration for this book and some of the interesting things in my life that kind of came together to create this book. Also, I grew up in North Carolina, so my Southern comes out when I read this book. 6th grade. By halfway through the year, I'm used to the changes of 6th grade. No more all-day elementary school classroom with my name taped to a desk. Now I have a schedule to remember, a locker combination, a different teacher every hour. But some things are just the same as last year, like the way the whole school buzzes with electric energy the day before spring break. The assignment. In English class, Ms. Berman gives us the assignment 10 minutes before the final bell. During the last week of school in June, she says, we'll be holding a 6th grade poetry slam. Any 6th grader who wants may submit a poem to the committee, and the winners will have the chance to read their poem at an assembly for the whole 6th grade. Every cell inside me goes quiet, like Ms. Berman's words are a cool, clean waterfall across my skin. I can almost hear the whisper of the battered notebook filled with poems I've written, stuffed inside my backpack. The theme for the poetry slam is what I know about myself, Ms. Berman says. In your poems, we want you to explore who you are. Not just the things anyone can see, but the things that make you, you, deep inside yourself. The deadline for submissions will be 2 weeks after spring break ends. Class dismissed. The room erupts, chairs scraping back against the floor, the flurry of students hurrying out into the April sunshine. But I sit still, glued into my chair by the glittering promise Ms. Berman has just laid out in front of me. A poem, my poem for the whole 6th grade. Blank slate. Cricket finds me after class, and we watch for our bus, together just like always, her backpack full of 7th grade textbooks bumping against her spine. Cricket is pretty much a genius, and so she gets put in all the advanced classes even though she's in 6th grade, just like me. Sometimes I envy Cricket's brain, how easily it seems to make sense of the world. Mine feels the opposite. Like every day I grow, I only get less clear on what it means to be Penny Rooney. Cricket's known forever what she wants, to work for NASA, put her great brain to work like Katherine Johnson, the mathematician who charted the course for the rocket that reached the moon. Next to Cricket, I feel like a blank slate, still figuring out where I fit in the puzzle of school, my family, the world full of people who seem to know exactly what it is that lights them up. Cricket moved in next door in 2nd grade. Her real name is Christine, like her grandma, but her parents call her Cricket for her cheerful, chirping chatter. Cricket's mama brought casserole after casserole the year I took all those trips to the hospital, so Mama didn't have to cook. We may be different, but we fit together perfectly. Cricket's been my best friend so long, sometimes I don't know where she ends and I begin. Notebook. On the bus, I pull out my poetry notebook, open to a fresh new page, and try to write Ms. Berman's poem. What I know about Penny Rooney. These are the things I know about Penny Rooney. Small girl, all bones and points, with brown hair and eyes. Black framed glasses that always fall too far down my nose. Poems that simmer and seethe under my skin, begging to come out, but never sound quite the way I hoped they would once they're written. Not so good at math. Numbers always tangle in my brain. A girl with lungs that don't always breathe the way they should. Why does it seem like I could write what I know about Cricket, or what I know about my parents or my sister, 100 times better than what I know about myself? So that's the beginning of the story. And as you can tell, the idea of what we know about ourselves is a big theme of the story and something I'm going to talk a little bit more about as I go on today. I wanted to start off by showing this video, which is a very serious and definitely not at all silly book trailer for this book.
This summer, experience the story of a young poet with cystic fibrosis and the friendship that will change her life. When Penny discovers a lost dolphin in the creek behind her house, Can she come up with a plan to help the dolphin return to her pod, even if her cystic fibrosis gets in the way? Find out in No Matter the Distance, available wherever books are sold.
I have to let it keep going for a minute because there's bloopers at the end too. Yeah, that's my daughter. She is the rock star. Yeah, that, and I will say Kitty is the absolute rock star of this video because she got tumbled on that blow-up whale so many times, over and over and over while we were, anyway, I actually, when this book came out, I made an actual like serious, like emotional music book trailer, and I showed that for a while. And then last year, we were in North Carolina near where I grew up at the beach at a family reunion, and we had this blow up whale, and I just looked at it one day and I looked at my daughter and I was like, I have an idea. And so a lot of hilarity ensued. Like I mentioned, you know, a major theme of this story is that Penny spends the book trying to figure out what are the things she knows about herself and what are the things that make her who she is and how has she learned those things. And I think that this is something that most of us at some point in our life, and sometimes at multiple points in our lives, find ourselves coming back to is who are we? What are the things that we know intimately about ourselves? What makes us different from those we love? And what are the things that we can see that other people may not be able to see? So I want to share a little bit today about the things that I know about myself and how I learned them and how those went into the making of No Matter the Distance. So once upon a time, there were two young college students who fell in love. This is my parents, Russ and Cindy, and they eventually had a very cute, very, very cranky baby. And this was me. And when I was first born, I was very fat and a cranky but seemingly healthy baby. But a few months into my life, I got very sick. You can see the difference in I've lost all the chubbiness from that first picture. And for about 2 months, my parents did not know what was happening. And I was admitted to the hospital over and over again. And at one point, the doctors told my parents that if I threw up again, I would probably die because my potassium level had become so low that my heart was in danger of stopping. And they went to specialist after specialist and hospital after hospital. And eventually, sort of randomly, about 2 months into this, I was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is a genetic disease. So it's something that is part of every cell in my body, just like my hair color or my eye color. It's something I was born with. And because I was diagnosed when I was 6 months old, I've known about it my whole life. And luckily for me, after my first 2 years where I was really, really sick and in the hospital a lot, after that, my health stabilized. And I was a pretty healthy kid for a lot of my growing up. And for a long time, it didn't feel like CF was too big of an issue in my life. In fact, my parents were so good at not making me feel different from other kids and not making me feel like it was such a big deal that I actually was convinced for several years that our neighbor who had asthma was very seriously ill and that I felt very sorry for her because I didn't know what it would be like to be that sick. So, you know, I thought I was pretty normal, despite the fact that I was spending a lot of time in doctor's offices and I was doing breathing treatments every day. I was able to live a pretty regular life. One of the things that was part of that regular life was daily breathing treatments. Most people with cystic fibrosis do several hours of treatments every day. This is the only picture I've ever found of me doing breathing treatments as a young kid, because this was before the age of digital cameras, and so there's just not as many pictures. And you can see in this picture that the way that my parents got me through those breathing treatments when I was growing up was reading. Breathing treatments were a time when I didn't have to do homework or assignments or anything else. They let me do whatever I wanted to do. And I did a bunch of school visits yesterday, and I felt like I needed to explain during my school visits that this was back before cell phones. This was really like when the internet was brand new, and this was when there wasn't a lot of stuff on TV. And so the thing that I did while I did these breathing treatments was I read. And I had always loved stories and reading, but when I was in probably between 2nd grade and 5th grade was when I really, really fell in love with stories. And what I really learned from these experiences growing up was that books could be escape hatches. They could take me wherever I wanted to go, no matter what was going on in my life, no matter how sick I felt, no matter how boring the breathing treatments were, because I was not a kid who liked to sit still. I could do whatever I wanted through books and stories. And I really fell in love with reading through those experiences. As I got a little older and hit middle school and high school, my health started getting a little bit more complicated. I started having to be admitted to the hospital most years, at least one time, for a couple of weeks of IV antibiotic therapy. I am the oldest of 6 kids in my family, and besides the fact that my health was getting more complicated when I was a preteen, the other thing that was happening at that time was that my mom got pregnant and gave birth to triplets. This is one of them. They're 12 years younger than me. They're like my first babies. And because of that, when I started being admitted to the hospital more regularly as a preteen and a teen, I spent the nights alone because my parents were wrangling 5 other kids, including 3 small babies. And I was kind of like, I didn't even really like having sleepovers at my friend's house because I just liked being at home where it was safe and normal. And so those nights in the hospital were really, really hard for me. And in general, during that time, I felt very, very lonely because while I was doing things like going to the hospital and dealing with kind of learning more about the more serious ramifications of cystic fibrosis, such as when I was 13, I learned that the life expectancy for my disease at that point was 34, which was pretty shocking. I mean, I'll be honest, when I was 13, 34 seemed really old, but I knew it wasn't as old as most old people get. And so I still, it still was a really shocking thing to learn. While I was dealing with all of that, most of my friends were dealing with much more normal things like having crushes and having body image issues. And I felt like I didn't really know anyone who understood the things that I was going through. What I knew about myself as a preteen because of these experiences was, first of all, I knew that there were not books about people like me. And like I mentioned, I had long before this learned that books could be my way of coping with the hard things in life. So one day when I was probably 12 or 13, I remember going to my local library, and I remember that they had a white wire rack of books. They were all paperback romances, and I looked at one of them and I read the back, and I took it to my mom and I was like, "Mom, look, this book is about a girl with cystic fibrosis. Can I check it out?" And she looked at the book and she was like, "You know what, honey, I don't want you to check this book out. I don't think that this book is going to be the kind of story that you want to read." And that book was called A Time to Die by Lurleen McDaniel. If anyone knows who Lurleen McDaniel was, a lot of people my age read her books growing up. She was famous for writing romances about sick kids who die at the end. Like she was sort of the mother of what's called sick lit, and all of her books have very tragic endings. This book is about somebody with cystic fibrosis who dies by the end of the book and sort of inspires the hero of the book to have a good life and a good character arc because of that. So my mom knew at that point what I didn't, which was that there were no books about people like me on the shelves. There were no books about people with cystic fibrosis who had dreams and ambitions and lives. All of the books, which this is a sampling of some of the very few books about cystic fibrosis that were available in the 80s and 90s, all of those books were about people who died. And she knew that that was not the book that I needed to see myself in. But because there were no books about people like me, that compounded that feeling of loneliness that I felt. What I knew about myself as a preteen because of this was that I was alone, I was unlucky, I didn't know what my future held, and I was often afraid. But that wasn't the only thing that I knew about myself growing up. I knew also that I had a lot of passions and interests, I was a musician. I played the violin and the piano, and I sang. And for a long time, I was a very serious violinist in high school and middle school, and I wanted to be an orchestra teacher. I knew that I was a good writer. I knew that I loved stories, and I loved learning to tell stories. I finished my first full-length novel when I was 13. It was a Harry Potter fan fiction. And my amazing dad, who has always been my biggest supporter, I asked him to print out the story for me. And I kept being like, Dad, have you printed out the story yet? And he was like, oh, the printer's having issues. I'm not sure what's happening. And he put me off for a couple months. And finally it was Christmas. And I opened up a printed and bound copy of my book, which when I talk about this to kids, I always have to be like, this was in the olden days. There wasn't self-publishing back then. So he had to do a bunch of research, and he actually sent it to a dissertation binder company. And so he got it printed by a company for a lot of money, I'm sure, by a company that printed dissertations. And I still remember the feeling of opening that and seeing my name on a book and thinking, wow, somebody believes in me so much that they think I could be a real author with my name on a real book. So I knew all of these things about myself. I also knew that I was passionate about the ocean. The ocean has always been my favorite place, and I love dolphins. When I was in high school, I got to do a Make-A-Wish trip, and my wish was to swim with a dolphin. I knew that I was smart, I knew I was creative, and I knew I was curious. In No Matter the Distance, Penny this is me as a kid. This is a fake picture of me as a kid, because again, there's no pictures of me doing treatments as a kid. So this is my daughter pretending to be Penny. In No Matter the Distance, Penny also is trying to figure out what she knows about herself. And one of the things that she thinks as she's trying to figure out how to write this poem is that she knows that a lot of people look at her and feel like the defining aspect of who she is her cystic fibrosis. And she knows that that's a big part of herself and who she is. I personally, as a disabled person, have never been a fan of the train of thought that says, don't define yourself by your illness or disability, because it absolutely defines my life. But it's only one thing of many that defines my life. And Penny also grapples with this throughout the story, just as I did growing up, as she tries to figure out who is she in addition to this thing that is very obvious to everybody around her. Another thing that I learned during those years growing up was how to tell stories. Like I mentioned, I discovered that books could be this amazing way to journey and adventure and have experiences that I couldn't have myself. And I was probably in like 5th or 6th grade when I realized that if I wrote the stories, I could make whatever I wanted happen all by myself. And one of the ways, again, that my parents would help me stay put to do my breathing treatments was in the days when nobody really had laptops. My dad had a work laptop, and he would sometimes let me use it while I did breathing treatments. And that was part of how I started writing during that time. It was one of the ways I passed the time. And it's kind of funny because today, my treatment time, which I usually do 2 to 4 hours a day, my treatment time is still my primary work time. In a very meta example, this picture is a picture of me working on this exact presentation while I'm doing my treatments. When I was working on this, I was going to put in a different picture of me on my computer while I was doing treatments, and then I was like, I am literally doing this thing right now. I'll just snap a selfie and stick that in. What I learned about myself, what I know about myself today because of those years of experience growing up, is that I am resilient. I can make good things come out of difficult things. Out of those difficult years of loneliness and feeling afraid and uncertain and unsure who I was, I learned how to love stories, and I learned how to tell stories. A couple of years ago, during the beginning of the pandemic in early 2020, I had a really bad case of writer's block, and I've never had writer's block that bad before. And I felt like I couldn't write about anything because the pressures of the real world were just too big, and I couldn't think of anything else. And I had outlined a different book that I was supposed to be writing at that time. And I couldn't get into it. And so I finally sat down and I gave myself permission to write whatever the heck I wanted. And I thought, what I want is to write a book about cystic fibrosis. And what I also want is to write a book about a girl who has a magical friendship with a dolphin, because that's always been my life goal and I've never managed to make it work. And so if you can't do something, you can write a book about it, and that's the next best thing. And so I sat down and I started, without outlining, without planning, I started writing the story of a girl with cystic fibrosis who lives near the Neuse River in North Carolina and finds a stranded dolphin in her backyard. And I gave myself permission to write it in the form of poetry, which is one of my favorite forms. And I'll be completely honest, it was a form I had always been too scared to let myself try, because until the last couple of years, it was not very popular and it was much harder to sell a book that was written in verse. That is thankfully really changed, and now it's a very popular format. And I decided I was just going to write about all the things that mattered the most to me. I always knew that I wanted to write a book about cystic fibrosis. And ever since my first book deal was announced, I've had a lot of people ask me, are you going to write a book about CF? When are you going to write a book about CF? And I knew that I wanted to do that, but I also knew for a long time I wasn't ready to do that. I knew that it was going to take a lot of looking at my own experiences and my own memories, and it was going to take wading through some difficult feelings to get to that point. And so it took until my fourth book when I finally was like, okay, I'm ready to do this. I feel like I've processed through enough ideas that I'm ready to sit down and do this. I probably am going to need you to, oh, nope, that one worked. And so I sat down and I took all of those ideas and all of those thoughts, and that is the book that became No Matter the Distance. And I have a lot of kids ask me, you know, is this book about your life? And it's not about my life. Sadly, I have never found a dolphin in my backyard. The universe really needs to get on that. But it's not about my life. And there's a lot of ways in which Penny and I are really different. But there are also a lot of ways in which we are very similar. One of the things that it was really important for me to write about this, I had read several other books about cystic fibrosis. There's a few more now than there were in the early 90s. And I had always been frustrated that I felt like the books that exist tell a very specific and often very sensationalized story about my disease. Many of the times that you read a book about cystic fibrosis, it's about kids who literally live in the hospital, which is not really something that happens. It's about kids who die or who are about to get a lung transplant. All of these are experiences that people with cystic fibrosis do have, but they're really the exception and the unusual circumstance. And I wanted to write a story that was more about a girl like I was, who sometimes is able to live a normal life and sometimes has a lot of health problems interfere with the things that she wants to do. Another thing that I really wanted to address with this book was the way that children with serious illnesses are often expected to handle their illness in a very specific way. They are often expected to be very positive, very optimistic, and to be able to be held up as an inspiring example to other people. If you think about commercials that you've seen about children with cancer or documentaries, many things use this narrative for kids. And when I was growing up, again, when I was a kid, the life expectancy for my disease was 34. When I was first diagnosed at 6 months old in 1988, my parents were told I wouldn't live to turn 20. And so in many ways, I was very lucky as a kid. But when I was a 10-year-old who had a severe phobia of needles because of the traumatic experiences that I had had as a baby and couldn't get my blood drawn without crying and having a panic attack, when I was going through those experiences as a kid, I did not feel lucky. And when nurses or doctors or other adults near me would say, hey, you shouldn't cry because this isn't so bad because you're still alive, I still didn't feel lucky. Like, I don't know if you've ever told a 10-year-old, like, you shouldn't feel the way you're feeling because it could be worse. It's not a super effective strategy. And even though I was a lucky kid in my circumstance, I really struggled with that idea, and especially with how much the adults in my life were telling me, hey, you need to not struggle with the things that you're experiencing because it could be worse. And that is what I wanted to talk about in this book. I wanted to push back on the idea that kids with serious illness need to stay positive and upbeat. And I wanted to show that even if your life could be harder than it is, that doesn't mean that it's not hard on an individual level to experience things like nights in the hospital, being woken up at 4 a.m. by somebody trying to draw your blood. All of these experiences that can be really traumatic for young people or old people that are often dismissed because it's not as bad as it could be. And I often joke that writing this book was sort of like 30 years of therapy in about 12 months. Because I found the thing that really surprised me. I thought, I'm going to set out to write this book that's pushing back on this idea that, that we are one of the lucky ones and that you need to not ever have a hard time. And I was super excited about this. And I was very surprised when I got my first round of editorial feedback from my editor. And she said, I feel like Penny is handling all of this very difficult stuff much too calmly. I think she needs to be angrier and more upset. And what really surprised me, first of all, that I apparently had not accomplished my goal, that I thought I'd done great. But what really surprised me was how much I had to look inside myself and stop my first instinct, which was to say, oh no, it's not that bad. This is normal. It's not a big deal. And I really had to realize that how much it was ingrained in me to dismiss Penny's struggles and to dismiss the feelings that she was feeling, because those feelings and struggles had been dismissed for me so much when I was growing up. And so it was a wonderful and healing and also sometimes a difficult writing experience to write about these things that I had experienced that were difficult, where I had not been given room to struggle. And one of the things that I really hope with this book is I hope that it will speak to other people with cystic fibrosis and also to any children who are in a circumstance where they feel like I felt, where they feel like nobody really quite understands what I'm going through. This is really hard, but there's not necessarily people who are giving me space to grieve and feel these feelings. I hope it will speak to kids in that circumstance and show them it's okay to have big feelings. It's okay to struggle, and it's okay to feel the way you feel. You don't have to, move immediately to positivity and optimism and recognition that you are the lucky one. Now, one last thing I want to talk about. When this book was published, after about 2 years of me, usually takes about 2 years from the time you sell a book to a publisher to when it's on shelf. So there were about 24 months between the time that I announced this and the time that it was out, and I was talking about how excited I was. I had even shared like some excerpts on Facebook. Everybody knew how excited I was about this book. I don't pick favorites among my books because they're all favorites for different reasons, but this is definitely the most important book that I've ever written. This is the first novel ever published about a character with cystic fibrosis that is actually by an author with CF. And so I was really excited about it. And then in the first week that it got published, my phone absolutely blew up with text messages from friends and family that were all like, Cindy, this is a book of poems. Why is it poems? I don't read poems. And I was like, I don't know, guys, you were not paying attention. Like, I made it very clear. But one thing that I have really found is that in our society, we have these specific ideas about what poetry is. And usually we think poetry is this thing for people with PhDs in colleges who like to be really confusing and obscure and like to feel superior, that they understand things that other people don't. And I don't know about you, but I know I have read plenty of poems in my lifetime where I got to the end of the poem and I went, look, I don't even know what I just read. And there is absolutely a time and a place for poetry that is complicated, that takes time and delving into to explicate and figure out what it's about. But something I find a lot of people don't realize is that that is not the only kind of poetry. One thing that I love about poetry is that there are so many kinds of poetry, and poetry can meet every reader where they're at. I think this poem is such a perfect example of this. This is a poem by a child named Neil, who was 6 years old when they wrote this, and it's called The Tiger. The tiger, he destroyed his cage. Yes, yes, the tiger is out. And I love this poem. I think this is such a perfect example of what poetry can be, because this poem is like, what, 10 to 15 words? But in those 10 to 15 words, Nail, age 6, tells us a whole story about this tiger who's in a cage and gets out of the cage and is excited about its freedom. And beyond that, this poem doesn't just tell us the story. This poem makes us feel the feelings. I don't know about you, but when I read, yes, yes, the tiger is out, I can feel the excitement of that tiger as it gets out of its cage. I also can feel a little bit of fear, because I always imagine myself, what if I was in the room when a tiger got out of its cage? I'm happy for the tiger, I'm not so happy for me. And so I think that poetry is pure emotion or feeling distilled into its purest and simplest form. And I think poetry can help us feel feelings better than almost any other form of writing. Another reason that I love poetry and that I felt like it particularly suited this book is because of the white space involved. So if you are not familiar with the concept of white space in writing, in every piece of writing, there is white area on the page left blank. On this slide, for instance, there's lots of white space. There's space here, here. Poetry, because of the way it's formatted, usually has quite a lot of white space compared to prose or non-poetry writing. And one thing that's nice about that is that it makes it easier to read and it makes it more accessible for many people. When I was 16, I ended up very, very sick. I was in bed for a year with a mystery illness that left me in enormous amounts of fatigue and pain. And not only was I in physical fatigue, but my brain was extremely tired. And I found I was unable to read a whole book. And during that time, I started reading and writing poetry. Because as it turns out, if you cannot make it through a whole novel because your brain is kind of broken, you can usually make it through a poem, because a poem is not very long. I also, during that time, ended up having to just sit and do nothing a lot, which was like the opposite of my natural self before that. And so I started really noticing things about the world that I'd never really noticed before. So I started reading poems during that time and writing about them. And the way that poetry is accessible is one of my favorite things about it. But the other thing that I love about the white space is that I feel like sometimes when you're reading about an emotionally heavy topic, having all that space on the page makes it feel a little less overwhelming. Because if I'm reading about something that's really sad or really hard, and there's like a really dense page of text, and I'm like, oh, I have to feel these feelings for every word of this dense page of text, that can be an overwhelming feeling. But when there's a lot of white space, it gives you a little bit of space to feel and process those hard emotions without it being quite so overwhelming. And so I've noticed that many novels that are written in verse tend to be about pretty big, difficult topics. And I think that is because poetry makes space for big feelings without it being overwhelming. This is a picture of when I was 16, when I had finally hit the point where I was able to get out of bed, but this mystery illness permanently changed my life. I started having to use a wheelchair when I went out. I had to learn new ways of interacting with the world. And that was a really difficult experience. Like 10 of 10, I would undo it if I could. But also, I will completely acknowledge that I would never have become the writer that I am today without this experience. Because like I said, before that experience, I had a lot of energy. I was constantly on the go. I did not like to sit and notice things. And now, as an author, my number one skill and my favorite thing as a writer is to make readers feel like they are experiencing the story and experiencing the feelings of the character as they read. And that is absolutely thanks to the skills that I developed during that year that I spent in bed. I wrote a poem that I want to share with you real quick. I wrote this last year, I think, when I was teaching a class about poetry, and one of my friends said, she was teaching it with me, and she said, okay, let's start by defining what poetry is to us. This is my answer to that. Poetry is the art of noticing, holding the world on your tongue like a snowflake, breathless and still, alive to that millisecond where you are filled with the taste of icy lace before it melts into nothingness. Poetry is attention, a willingness to pause, to silence every buzzing thing inside, to listen to the wild stillness, to feel the creaking, turning earth glide beneath your feet. Poetry is to worship at the altar of this moment. Let past and future slip through your fingers. To be, to be, to be. And that is, to me, kind of that sums up all my feelings about poetry and what poetry can do for us, how it can help us to feel and experience our own feelings and the feelings of the writer. What I learned about myself, what I know about myself because of that difficult experience in high school that changed my life, is that I am a poet. I am able to take that time to notice the world around me and to put it into words that help other people see and feel what I see and feel. In No Matter the Distance, Penny writes a poem about what she knows about herself. Throughout the book, she writes several different drafts of this poem as she is trying to figure out what does she know about herself. And in combination with this book release, I made an activity for teachers to use where they can have their students write what I know about myself poems as well. And I believe, Liz, do we have copies back there? There are copies on the black table of one of these worksheets for anyone who's interested in doing this as well. I wanted to share before I finish 2 example poems. This is one that I wrote, What I Know About Cindy Baldwin. Brown-haired woman with stars in her eyes, always dreaming of the next transforming thing. Cold fingers, but a heart on fire. I am full of contradictions, exhausted yet excited, curious and confused, fierce though little. A brain full of books, hands always moving, trying, paths, hobbies, sometimes trying others' patience. Often it seems I am made new every year, unfurling each season a fresh set of butterfly wings, vulnerable and raw, beautiful and strong. Oh, I guess I actually don't have, darn it, I thought I had the other poem up there that my daughter wrote, so I guess I cannot share that one. But I want to, whether you pick up one of those poetry activities on the way out, I want to challenge you as you go about the rest of your day to think about, what do you know about yourself? What are the things that you know about who you are inside, and how did you learn those? What are the experiences that have shaped you and taught you resilience and creativity and all of the things that we as humans need to be able to get through this often difficult life? I also want to open up a little bit of time in case anyone has any questions about my book, my writing, or anything else I've shared today. Anyone? Oh. Thank you. Uh-huh.
Questions.
Go right ahead.
Related to your cystic fibrosis. My age, approaching 70, the family in town who had cystic fibrosis, lots of children, some had it, some didn't, but the ones who did, we never really knew them because they didn't last very long. And did any of your siblings also inherit the situation?
Yeah, so I am actually kind of, I feel like, an anomaly. So for those who don't know, cystic fibrosis is passed on by a recessive gene, much like blue eyes. So you need to have a gene from each parent, and if you have 2 parents who each carry the gene, then each child has a 1 in 4 chance of having CF. So usually when you have several kids in a family, you end up with more than one person with CF. I'm the oldest of 6, and none of my siblings have CF. The first 2 after me are what my parents lovingly refer to as Russian roulette babies, where they just sort of rolled the dice and neither of them ended up having CF. After that, in the beginning of 2000, the year 2000, they tried at that point a very new procedure for in vitro fertilization that allowed embryo screening. It's very common now. At that point, we actually had to travel out of state because it was only done in 2 places in the country. That's also why they have triplets, because in the year 2000, they used to implant 4 embryos in IVF, which anyone who's familiar with that knows that sounds kind of crazy. They do not do that anymore. So they got triplets, but none of the triplets have a CF gene. So that I feel like is very unusual. Most of my friends who have siblings have had at least one sibling with CF, and most of my friends have had at least one sibling die of cystic fibrosis. And it's, I've never had a sibling with it, but I have lost some of my very best friends to the illness.
Just to dovetail that. Two more, and then I'll stop. So I have a question about your own bringing a child into life, and maybe you've kind of answered that because maybe your husband didn't carry the gene, and therefore it's a non-issue. And also, so when I was of age, it wasn't a very long lifespan. For your time, that extended a little longer. But you're living proof that, I mean, I don't know, maybe you're only 24 right now.
A little older than that.
Treatment must have improved.
Yes.
Where lifespan is really.
I will turn 36 this year, and last year on my 35th birthday, it was an incredible, or 34th birthday, it was an incredibly emotional experience because that was 34 was the number that was sort of the official number when I was a teenager, and it was very, very emotional to hit that number. It was also, honestly, I had a midlife crisis because my daughter was 8, and I looked at her and I was like, holy crap, I've only planned until she's an adult, and think I'm gonna live a lot longer than that, and I don't know what I'm gonna do with my life. So that was kind of an interesting and surprisingly difficult experience. The life expectancy has increased throughout my life. In the last 15 years, it has increased exponentially, far more than it ever has. In 2012, there was a new medication released. There was the first medication in history to help to correct a cellular defect in a genetic disease. It actually, at the cellular level, helped to correct the cystic fibrosis mutation. The first version of that drug was only available to about 1,000 people in the world who had a rare mutation of CF, and I was one of them. The unexpected and amazing side effect of that medication was that many women with CF who were unable to conceive were suddenly able to conceive. And that I was one of the first people to figure that out. It was kind of exciting and kind of scary. It's now well known. I saw a graph a couple of months ago that was babies born to women with CF, and it's like, and then it hits 2020, which is when a drug that treated more people with CF came out, and it's like it's been amazing. Because of this class of medications, which are now available to like 97% of patients with cystic fibrosis, the life expectancy at this point is honestly a big question mark. It has risen to at least 50. There's some studies that speculate for the babies born with cystic fibrosis these days who are able to get on this treatment within the first few years of their life, that they may live into their 70s or possibly even 80s. There's speculation that for people my age who have made it this far okay, that we might live as far as into our 60s. So at this point, I feel like that number has just been replaced with this. Who knows? And it's really kind of amazing. So yeah, it's been a big difference. Did I see a kid hand up here? No? Okay. Yeah.
Well, this isn't exactly relevant. I think you're absolutely marvelous, and congratulations.
Thank you.
You have given me permission today, because I quite recently and rapidly have become legally blind. And it's okay if I'm not always saying, isn't this wonderful?
Yes. Thank you for sharing that with me. It is, there is such pressure. And I should also add, like, I'm a pretty positive and optimistic person. I'm definitely like usually a glass half full person, but I also really believe that in order to be a glass half full person, I have to let myself have space to grieve. And I have to let myself have space to feel those feelings so that I can then move on and say, hey, this didn't work out the way I expected it to or hoped it would. And now I can learn a way of doing things with an authentic, emotional, paradigm. Yeah, so thank you for sharing that.
She's listening to the book.
Oh, I love that. You know what? Audiobooks are amazing. I am such a fan of audiobooks. I love them. And I have been very lucky with my audiobook readers too. I've had really amazing narrators. Did you have a question?
See. So, in the story, Penny's best friend's.
Oh. Why did I choose for Penny's best friend to move away? So when I was between 10 and 12 years old, I had a best friend whose name was Mallory, and we used to play together all the time. We had all of the best games. We also argued a lot, but we loved each other very much. She felt like my sister, and her family moved from North Carolina to Missouri. And it was one of the hardest things that I had ever experienced at that time because I loved her so much, and I had never found anyone in my life until then who felt so much like she understood who I was. And it was really hard to have that experience of having that relationship and then having that relationship end because she moved away. And so I wanted to write about that because I think that that's something that happens to a lot of kids. And I think that it's hard, even as an adult, it's hard to move. But I remember moving as a kid and having friends move. And it's even harder when you're a kid because you don't have any control over that. You know, Penny doesn't have any control over whether Cricket's family moves, and neither does Cricket. And so I wanted to write about that because I know that that's something that happens to a lot of kids. And also, the theme of this book was about how when we love people, even when they're not with us, we can still be connected to them. So there's a lot of different relationships that Penny realizes, like she realizes with Cricket, she realizes with Rose, and she realizes with her new cystic fibrosis friends that she meets online, that even though they're not with her physically, they are still a part of her and that she can still love them. And that's something that is an important theme in my life, especially because just like Penny, I can't get together in person with any of my friends with cystic fibrosis. And one of my very best friends, who I've known for 20 years now, he and I spend all day, every day, texting each other and have for like the better part of 20 years. And I have never met in person because we both have cystic fibrosis. And so we might make each other sick by getting together. And so I wanted to show that sometimes, even when a relationship is not the kind of relationship we would think where everybody's all close together, that they can still be a really important person to us. So hopefully that answers your question. Thank you for that.
My teacher perspective, my brain was already like spinning on all the fun different lesson plans you could do with this book. So I just want to say thank you for kind of the thoughtfulness, because then when you said it's written in poems, I'm like, oh my gosh, like, you can take this so many different directions in terms of knowing yourself and that kind of coming of age idea, and lead kids through that and also give them a new perspective. So yeah.
Well, thank you. And do you want to know my favorite educational fact? So one of the points in this story is that Rose, who's the stranded dolphin, is sick and she has pneumonia, which is a common illness for all marine mammals because they have lungs and they live in the water. And when I knew that I wanted to have a dolphin that was stranded in a creek, and so I started researching, why do dolphins get stuck in fresh water? And one of the reasons is that often they're sick, and either they're sick and they end up stranded, or they end up stranded and then they get sick from the fresh water that they're not supposed to be around. And when I was reading that, I was trying to figure out, like, what sicknesses do dolphins get? What are their symptoms? What might be a realistic thing? So I started reading medical journals, and this is still the most amazing synergistic research thing that has ever happened to me on any of my books. I started reading research journals that talked about how dolphins and other marine mammals can frequently get pneumonia from specific rare bacteria that are found in the water, which happen to also be rare bacteria that people with cystic fibrosis get pneumonia from. And I'm talking, like, I've literally never seen any of these bacteria mentioned except in context of cystic fibrosis. They are not common. And it was the most amazing thing. And I read all sorts of studies. I read about dolphins who are given pulmonary function tests, which is one of the tests that people with CF are given. I read about a manatee who was given a nebulizer treatment, just like people with cystic fibrosis do every day. And it was such a cool thing that I was like, this is an amazing connection, both between Penny and her dolphin friend Rose, and between, you know, so many of us with cystic fibrosis who love marine mammals and have this incredible connection. So that's like literally my favorite fact I've ever learned researching a book. So, okay, there was a hand over here.
When you start writing, do you think, was your intention to write books for the age range you were right? Or how was that process?
It actually wasn't at first. Before I wrote Where the Watermelons Grow, I actually wrote 6 other novels. And all of them were, except for the Harry Potter fan fiction that I wrote when I was 13, all of them were young adult books, and most of them were historical books as well. And there were 2 books in particular that I tried to get published before Where the Watermelons Grow. And it was kind of funny because I had always loved middle grade books, and I actually was working for a while as a middle grade book reviewer. And I actually said to my husband at one point, I was like, it's kind of funny that like, it turns out I mostly want to read books for middle graders, but I have never written one. And I was like, I don't know, I've just never had a good idea. Someday if I get an idea that's good, then I'll write that book. And that turned out to be Where the Watermelons Grow. And I have stuck to that so far. I do, I'm expanding to chapter books this year, and I do hope to write for other ages of readers too in the future. But I absolutely, middle grade is my favorite because it is the most psychologically fascinating time in a child's life, I think, because in that pre-adolescent time, you're not really a kid, but you're not really a teenager. And there's aspects of both of those inside you. And also, kids at that age think that they're responsible for everything. They think that they're responsible for everything that goes wrong in their family, everything in their own life, and they have this huge overdeveloped sense of personal responsibility for things that are happening. And so I think it's a really interesting, it's an interesting time. Psychologically, it's the age when kids start to recognize that the world is separate from them, and they start to have more understanding of that separateness. And it's just a really interesting time to explore. So, and it's fun because my daughter now is 11. So with this book, when I sold it, she was 9, I think. And it was the first book that she had completely aged into my target audience. So she was actually the first person that read it. And she gave me a little page of notes on all the things that she liked and the suggestions she had. And it's been really, really fun to be able to share that with her because, again, it's just a really fun age. So yeah, thank you. Are there any other questions?
I noticed in your presentation as well as in the book that you talk about vests, but I don't understand what the vests are for.
Oh, yeah. So I think I've got a picture. I think that picture with my daughter, she has actually, there's a picture of the vest. So this is a type of airway clearance. So lungs have little hairs called cilia, and in a normal person's lungs, your cilia are sort of going like this all day and getting dust, smoke, mucus, anything that might be stuck in your lungs out. In cystic fibrosis, the cilia were like this, like they don't really move very well. And so you cannot clear your lungs on your own. There are many different kinds of airway clearance techniques, but one of the most popular ones is a vest. It's literally just called the vest, and it vibrates in different patterns to make vibration waves that stimulate the cilia to move and to clear out your lungs. So at least twice a day, I strap this on and I do my nebulizer, and that helps to clear out anything from my lungs. So when I'm doing this daily, then my lungs function a little bit more like a normal person's that are regularly clearing themselves. So yeah, it's pretty fun. When I was in college, I used to give concerts to my roommates where I would sing while wearing the vest and shaking. It was it was pretty funny. Okay, there was a hand over here.
I mostly wanted to thank you because we share the same doctor in the CF clinic at OHSU. And I have a mild form of cystic fibrosis. I have a common gene and a rare gene. And I was diagnosed when I was 52, a couple of years ago. And I remember talking to my doctor and saying, I know I have a mild form of this disease, and there are a lot of people that are so much sicker than I am. I was like, but I'm overwhelmed, and this is hard. And I also have a rare connective tissue disorder that causes
Ehlers-Danlos syndrome?
Exactly.
I also have that.
So that really hit me over the last few years. And so between the two illnesses, I was working as a nurse. I had to stop working, and I used to be very active. My entire life has completely changed, and I felt very lost and kind of trying to get my footing as to what does my life look like now. and trying to put a positive spin. And even though on Sunday, many days, I'm like, this just really sucks. And so my doctor, when I was talking to him, he said, you know, even though you have a mild form of the disease, it's still really, really hard. And he said, I have this book for you.
Was it Aaron?
Yes. And so of course I went home and ordered it and read it. And so it just like you said, I knew about cystic fibrosis. I suspected I had it for many years because I was diagnosed with bronchiectasis, but the testing just wasn't there for my form of the disease. And especially the milder form, which kind of answers your question, because there are people that are in my support group. We have one gentleman who's 80.
Yeah. I think I heard some more recently about somebody who was diagnosed in their early 90s, which absolutely blew my mind.
Yeah.
They had it all their life, but it was a mild enough form that it was always diagnosed as other issues.
Yeah. So the book brought me a lot of comfort, and then you can imagine how excited I was when I saw your post.
I'm so glad you got to come talk to me after.
I was like, oh my God, I feel like I'm eating small fish. I'm not a star person at all. And so anyway, but I find it very interesting that you also have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And I was also, when I was talking to Dr. Turnbull, I was saying, you know, I've been writing a little bit about Ehlers-Danlos. I can't write very well.
Come talk to me. I have gone the rounds on that.
So at that point, he was like, Cindy has this writer's group. But I I talked myself out of it because I have a lot of projects and never seem to finish them, even though I've always been a finisher my whole life. Well, now the wood or whatever I want to work on sits there for quite a while until I have a day where I have energy where I can do it. And so I talked myself out of your writing work.
Oh, please come talk to me after. I'll talk about it. You will not be alone.
Yes, but your book just brought me so much comfort. And he also said to me, you know, it's written in verse, but it's very easy to read. And I thought to myself, well, I don't even know what verse is, but I'll try it. And it actually did bring me a lot of comfort when I would flip the page and there'd be like a few words and a lot of space. I was like, okay.
Oh yeah, it's comforting. He was one of the ones who he wasn't quite as confrontational as some people. He was like, I didn't realize it was written this way. This is a really unique style.
Well, this is for me. Very easy. He's doing a lot of marketing for you.
Well, good. I'll have to tell him things. I always talk to my book to some other people too.
This is a quick question. After you wrote your book, did you have a dolphin scientist review it?
I did not. I actually reached out to some and was hoping to be able to do it. And it was because I was writing it in 2020 and 2021, a lot of people still weren't really in the office. And so I think it was kind of a victim of pandemic weirdness that I wasn't able to. But I did read a lot I now have an extensive list of marine mammal medical journal articles on which is, a super random thing to be researching as somebody who is not a biologist. So yeah, it was, I was grateful that because of my health background, I was used to reading, PubMed studies and stuff. So that helped a lot.
Have you heard from any marine biologists?
That's a good question. I don't think so. But yeah, I actually, because I grew up in North Carolina, I actually reached out to the Duke Dolphin Research Center, who's mentioned in the book. But again, I think they just weren't really answering emails and stuff at that point. So anyway, we're kind of out of time, but I want to thank you all so much for coming. Again, there's lots of fun swag and poetry worksheets in the back that you're welcome to get. I'm also more than happy to sign books or answer additional questions. Thank you all for coming, for supporting me and my books and the Novel Idea Program.